Hello and welcome back to another episode of Project Stargate. I'm your host, Mark Brenner. In today's episode, we have the Paranormal Pennsylvania Files with Stan Gordon. Stan Gordon has been researching and investigating the paranormal, including cryptozoology, ufology, and other amazing subjects for over 60 years. He put out a great documentary film through UFO TV called the UFO Crash at Keksburg, The Untold Story. And I recommend all of you listeners to check this out. It's available on Amazon. Great documentary, well made. Stan has researched everything from UFOs, like I said, to cryptozoology and other things that go bump in the night. Without further ado, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our friend of the research community, or the Pennsylvania's paratrooper of the paranormal, Stan Gordon. Stan, welcome to the program, sir, and thank you for being with us.
And thank you for having me on the program, Mark.
Outstanding. Stan, for those of our listeners who aren't as familiar with you or are new to this research field, can you give us a little bit of detail on your background and tell us how you got started and interested in this baffling and amazing field of research?
Well, actually, I started this when I was 10 years old back in 1959 as a youngster that was interested in electronics and science, and I happened to be tuning around on the AM radio dial one evening during Halloween, and it was a radio show talking about strange occurrences. They were talking about haunted houses and flying saucers and strange creatures, and I was curious. I wanted to know, these people making these stories up, are they telling the truth? So I began to make a lot of trips to my local Greensburg library and read all the books they had on the subject. I was 16 years old in 1965 when the Keksburg Incident happened about 12 miles from where I live, and I started documenting that case as it was breaking on the news that day, and continued to, every once in a while, still receive some information about the case. So I was out in the field after that. 1969, I set up a hotline for the public to report UFO sightings, but what I found out was very quickly that people were calling about anything strange and unusual, not just UFOs, and that hotline has been continuously active since that time period. Right after the last few days, I continually get reports of current and past reports, so I'm always busy with email and phone reports coming in. In 1970, I founded the first of three volunteer research groups that would investigate UFOs, Bigfoot cryptids, and other phenomena across the state of Pennsylvania. We started out in the greater Pittsburgh area as a small group, and the group was somewhat unique in that most of the people involved were specialists. We had scientists and engineers and technicians and police officers and former military people, all kind of specialists, and we were all volunteer. We did this around our full-time jobs, but I had it organized that we would respond to cases 24 hours a day, the best as we could, and we did that in many incidents. By 1973, we had extended to cover the whole state of Pennsylvania, and we were actually surprised at the response we were getting. And we actually began to get referrals from the news media and law enforcement across the state, so we were very busy with reports come in all the time. And that led us up to this massive wave that happened in 1973, which I'm sure we'll talk about tonight.
Absolutely, we're going to talk about that. It sounds like you started out with a pure grassroots effort, for lack of a better term, and it's just blown up into something amazing. As far as the Keksburg incident, just briefly, for those of our listeners who, like I said, who aren't as familiar with your research, can you just give a kind of a brief overlay of what happened in Keksburg, Pennsylvania, from its tracking it in Canada, the object, and to its landing or crash, and what happened? Can you give us a little brief, give our listeners just a brief overview of that situation?
Yeah, it's rough to do. It could take us days just to cover some of the information we found on Keksburg, but the basic scenario was it was December 9th, 1965, about 4:47 p.m. locally here in the Eastern time zone. And there were multitudes of reports from the tip of Ontario, Canada, basically over Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, this brilliant fiery object moving across the sky. And again, about 4:47 p.m. in the greater Pittsburgh area, there were multitudes of reports that were coming into the police departments, the radio and TV stations, and newspapers of people seeing this flaming object moving across the sky. Well, it moved into Westmoreland County, which is where I'm located. And, again, a lot of what I'm telling you now, we didn't know right at that time and that date. But anyhow, the object moved over the city of Greensburg, and it moved roughly out towards Route 30 East. And now we found out years later it made a turn to the south, and it was seen sequentially by people in many of those little rural communities, such as Marguerite and Norvelt, from Mammoth. And the object continued out to the mountains of Laurelville, where we're told it kind of hesitated, made a turn, and began to track back towards Keksburg, made another turn, then went down to that wooded ravine. And people locally who saw that object said it didn't come down at a high rate of speed, like you would have, for example, with a reentry of space debris or meteor. They said it came down almost like it made a controlled landing. Well, what we didn't know at the time was, and over the years, I tracked down hundreds of people who were involved in the case, and but what I found out from some of the locals was that some of these people went down into the woods soon after the object fell, and they came across this large metallic, kind of an acorn-shaped object, kind of an off-gold bronze color, big enough for a man to stand up inside of it. It was approximately 10 to 12 feet in length, about 8 to 10 feet in diameter, shaped again like an acorn, but it was seamless. There was no weld marks, no seams, no fuselage, no wings that were apparent. And one witness, who was a young volunteer fireman at the time, who unfortunately I just got the sad word he passed away last week.
Oh no!
And he was only a few feet away from the object, and he was a machinist most of his life. And he always said to me, until he passed away, he always kept the same account. He said it looked like somebody took liquid, kind of a molten liquid, and put it into an acorn-shaped mold, because it was one solid, smooth piece of metal. And that's a really important description. And on the raised-up back of the object, like you would have on the back of the acorn, he called it the bumper area. He said raised up off that area were these markings that looked more like symbols. And over the years after it happened, from his memory, he went to libraries and looked up ancient writings, and he said the closest thing he could remember was something that looked similar to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it's an amazing story, because what happened was, as this story is breaking on the news all over the greater Pittsburgh area, that this object, whatever it was, had fallen in Westmoreland County, hundreds of people descended on that small farming community that evening. So what I find out was that first you had the local witnesses, then you had volunteer fire departments being called out because they didn't know what was going on, and they thought it was a possibility that an airplane had crashed. So the fire department responding to a possible downed aircraft, a downed airplane in the area, so they're looking for a downed aircraft. But some of those search teams found the object. They didn't know at that point that some civilians had already been down there. And soon after, what was very interesting was the military shows up. So you had multitudes of eyewitnesses there, including reporters were there that evening from all the major radio, TV, and newspapers sources in the greater Pittsburgh area who came out to investigate the UFO report, but they either see or interact with military. So they see military trucks, they see some of these people, they see other authorities at the scene, and that in itself was interesting. Like, what is the military doing in this small farming community here in western Pennsylvania? Well, what we also found out was among the various type of equipment on the scene, there was a large military flatbed tractor trailer that removed the object with a tarp over it around 1 o'clock in the morning. But over the many, many years of investigation, one thing I've always been very careful with on this case and others is I don't like to bring details out unless I have enough confirmation from other sources. So one of the details that for years it took me able to track down and find independent sources that confirmed this report was fact, there wasn't just one military flatbed tractor trailer, there were two at the scene. And I found that one of them had a lower, longer cargo, whatever it was, covered with a tarp. It went to the air base in Pittsburgh, I was told, earlier in the evening, but the main object with the covered tarp of the recovered object went out around 1 o'clock in the morning, and I learned from independent sources that it went to Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio, during the early morning, the next morning of December 10th. I was told that they backed the tractor trailer, the trailer and the object into a hangar. They set up a security perimeter around it. They were given a shoot-to-kill order to anybody approached the hangar without the proper clearance. It didn't stay on the base that long. It continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and later I learned exactly what building they took it to at Wright-Patterson. It was not Hangar 18. It was a different facility.
Right.
And where it's at today, we've heard rumors and stories. We don't know for sure if it's still there. We heard it may have been moved, but we have no way to confirm that. It's a long, interesting story. So whatever this object was, it's relatively large for 1965. It's making change in direction along its trajectory. It makes a slow descent with no parachutes. Nobody reporting parachutes found at the scene. And it's very interesting, just the description alone. So there's many, many unanswered questions. There have been multitudes of theories on what it may be from the time it happened up to recent years. But there still is more to the story. There's certain details that I'm aware of that I've not released yet, and I hope I'm able to get confirmation sometime before I would bring this out. But it's a mystery. It's still one of those unsolved mysteries that hopefully someday we'll have an answer, but it may be one of those things that we may never have a definitive explanation.
This is a very important case to me. The thing that I've always found fascinating about this case is the sheer amount of eyewitnesses who are very credible, like the firefighter, the gentleman I saw on Unsolved Mysteries many years ago. That man it seems like a very, very credible eyewitness to this situation. In your honest opinion, what do you think was inside that object?
You know, again, as I've said for years and years, I keep an open mind to all possibilities of what this thing may have been. And we've heard different stories, and I mean, we could spend a long time just on this subject, like I said.
Sure.
There was the one person that mentioned on the video, but there's been another person that came forward who didn't know this person and gave me some similar information, and there's other information I have which suggests the possibility that there was someone or something inside of the object. And, you know, if that's the case, and there was not a good description, there's not a lot of detail, but indications are there may have been someone or something inside. And being an open-minded but skeptical, could this have been a human passenger with some type of accident like a fire that distorted what they saw, or could it be something much stranger? I don't have the answers. Hopefully someday we will. But like I said, I think there's more to this story than meets the eye.
And so, as do I, Stan. That, like I said, I think that's one of the most fascinating cases. And even as you know, I grew up watching Unsolved Mysteries. I think most of us did, and that was one of the segments that really stuck out with me over the years. But that was not your first case that you investigated, was it?
No, I've been interested in this since I was a young kid, and I heard stories, of course, growing up and when I was in high school. Some of my friends would come to me and share experiences their families or friends had and told me about them, so I was always aware. And there were multitudes of cases that I had been involved with. And, going back to the 60s, some of the cases I got involved with, the spring of 66, this is outside of Latrobe, and this is Westmoreland County, so this is very close to the Chestnut Ridge, and I'm sure you'll hear me talk about that tonight. The Chestnut Ridge is a mountain range that extends, it's about 100 miles long, maybe a little less, that extends through Westmoreland, Fayette, Indiana County, and southwest PA, and extends down to outside of Morgantown, West Virginia, near Preston County. It's probably one of the most active areas year after year for everything from UFOs to Bigfoot to cryptids to mystery booms to underground sounds. All kind of phenomena occur, especially along that area in Westmoreland and Fayette County. So this happened back in the spring of 66. It was around 4 o'clock in the morning. This is one of the first cases I looked into. And the woman was awakened by her dog that was making an odd whining noise and spinning in a circle. So she thought something was wrong with the dog. The dog was sick. So she took the dog outside. And while she's walking the dog, she happens to look up, and right above the roof of her home is this large, solid, metallic object that's shaped like a child's top that's hovering and spinning about 80 feet over the roof of her home. Wow. And the object surrounded in a red glow, completely silent, And she became very, very upset. And as she watched, the object suddenly rose up into the sky and shot up into the sky and gone in a matter of seconds, and went inside and tried to wake her husband up and tell him what I saw, and he didn't want to be bothered. But that was an interesting case. In August of '66, near Adamsburg Cutoff, this is the major road. This is Route 30. This would be west of Greensburg. And there were two women that evening driving eastbound, and they're coming up to this area at the Adamsburg Cut where there's a very large power tower. So I believe it's a 500 kV power tower there. And they notice that there's something flickering, some kind of an object below the wires, and it drops below the wires. As they move in closer, this thing that's under the wires suddenly begins to move in their direction towards the highway, and it gets right to their car. It comes directly over top of the car. As I remember, they had a small sports car with the top down. This was a dark oblong-shaped object, about as long as a sports car. It was so low they ducked their heads. They thought it was going to hit them, and they got a pretty good look at it. And they went home. They called the state police. And these sightings get more interesting and more interesting. But one of the cases that always stuck with me among many I've investigated, and there's many we can talk about. This was in February '68. This was in rural Westmoreland County, and this involved two brothers, both young guys at the time. The younger brother was a big believer in the UFO phenomena. His older brother was a firm skeptic and non-believer. And they would get so intense, such arguments, they would get into fist fights over UFOs. Well, the older brother didn't believe, ended up going to the Navy. He got a very high-level security clearance, I understand. He was working on one of the most advanced aircraft carriers, and then he retired from the Navy. So in the February of that year, he retired, and he got married, and he and his wife came back to the area, and they rented a small farmhouse out in the country. So that afternoon in February, it was supposed to start snowing, so he happened to look out the window, and right in front of the window, he sees this long rod that's it's a long rod that's extending out, I believe, about 20 feet or so from the window, and he realized this long rod is attached to this large, solid, metallic gray object, kind of oval-shaped with a dome on it, and this object itself, now it's about 50 to 60 feet in diameter. The bottom appears hollow. It's about 50 feet away. So this thing's 50 feet off the ground, 50 feet away from him, just hovering above a fishing pond. And he's looking at this thing. He sees what appears to be windows or portals in the dome in the lower part of the object, what looks like instrument panels, and at times flashes of light through the portholes. The hollowed-out bottom looked to be about 20 feet in diameter. There were numerous lights spinning in it. And he calls to his wife, who comes out and starts screaming. She can't believe what's going on, what she's seeing. So it's starting to snow, but he calls his brother in Greensburg several miles away and tells him what's going on. The one who believed in, and he and his wife come out to the area. Took a little while to get there. By the time we got out there, the roads are getting pretty icy. And this thing is still there, but it's about, I believe, about 100 feet off the ground, hovering right up in the sky. And they watch this thing, and all of a sudden it accelerates up into the sky. It looks like a bright red star, and it goes out of sight. And it was just amazing, apparently, from what they told me. And they called the local Latrobe Airport, and they said they had received many other similar reports. And this fellow told me, he said, if I hadn't seen it for myself, I could not have been convinced. So, and that's very common. With all these cases I work on, so many of the witnesses I interview for UFOs or Bigfoot or cryptids are people who did not believe these things could occur. And many of them, their lives have been changed by these appearances and by these encounters, because they're seeing something that's not supposed to exist, but it is. And so those are just a few of the examples of some of the cases, and we have many, many more recent cases we can talk about.
Sure, absolutely. In due time, we definitely need to get into some of that. But one thing what amazes me about your research is almost like you have your own intel agency. It's just so cool. Me and my partners, we followed your work for years, and this is this is, I think, your research has been invaluable to the research field and the UFO and paranormal communities. Let's talk about Chestnut Ridge, if you don't mind. Tell me all about that.
Well, I started hearing about the ridge. If I remember properly, it was around 1969. I had gotten a call of an incident in daylight along a busy route. I believe it was Route 22, 119 intersection, of a very large cigar-shaped object hovering over the trees, and people were pulling their cars off watching this thing hovering one afternoon. So I was out there and interviewing witnesses, and over the next few days, I started tracking down other neighbors and people around there and interviewing them about what they saw. And people began to ask me about and telling me about things that they had experienced or they knew people experienced several miles down the road in that area, in that part of what was the Chestnut Ridge. And that's when I began to first hear of these stories of all kind of strange, weird things, from underground sounds and strange lights and UFO sightings and Bigfoot encounters and all kind of weird things. And it's been going on apparently historically for years and years. I mean, I have reports that go back to at least the 1950s, but I know there's cases that go back long before that. And in fact, on the Fayette side of the ridge, the earliest firsthand witness that I've been able to talk to who had a Bigfoot encounter goes back to 1931 from Indian Head in Fayette County, of a woman who lived on a farm, and this creature, a 6-7 foot tall hairy creature, would on occasion come back and visit the farm, and they would all see it, and gave great detail of these appearances so many years ago. And but all kind of things. We've had Thunderbird sightings up there. We've had many Bigfoot sightings, all kind of weird creature sightings, lots of UFO sightings, and it's an ongoing thing. I mean, even in the last year, we've had incidents up there, and I know in February and all through March of this year. So I'm about 30 miles from Pittsburgh, which of course is a big metropolitan area, and you're hearing more about the UFO phenomenon on the news, but there's so much that's not being discussed. And one of the things I found out about the UFO phenomenon a long time ago is, and it's ongoing, a lot of these sightings are not in rural areas. A lot of these sightings are occurring over more populated areas. We've had incidents in downtown Pittsburgh. We have an incident over the bridges. I had a case years ago of one of the big malls, Monroeville Mall outside of Pittsburgh, where an object hovered right over the top of the mall, seen by people all around the area. Just multitudes. We've had incidents on the Turnpike. But you don't hear about these things in the news very rarely because the witnesses want no publicity, and that still goes on. Many people report things, and many of these are very credible people. Some of them hold some pretty important positions that call in, and they want no publicity, which I understand exactly where they're at.
Absolutely.
But these are the things that are going on, and one of the areas that I found very fascinating, and this ties in even deeper, which we'll get into with the Bigfoot phenomena, but are what I call mini UFO sightings. And these mini UFO sightings are really intriguing, and these go back to cases I've been involved with since the 1960s. And from what I recall, one of the first incidents I heard about took place back in the late 60s on a golf course outside of Pittsburgh, where some fellows were playing golf that afternoon, and these little spheres, maybe a few inches in diameter, were hovering right over top of their head, and they were swinging their golf clubs at them, and every time they swung the golf clubs, these little spheres would move up away from them, and then they would come back down, and they were kind of having fun swinging their golf clubs at these things. But these things are really interesting. So what I found out is, and I'm involved in multitudes of cases involving what I call mini UFOs, this real small ones look like kind of oversized fireflies. They're about 1 to 2 inches in diameter. But the majority of reports involve objects that are about 1 to 2 feet in diameter, sometimes solid metallic looking, but in other cases, they're just bright light sources of various colors. But what's so intriguing about this, these are not objects in the sky. These are objects very low to the ground. And in many cases, these objects have come right up very close to people. I've had them hover right in front of people's windows at our homes and tap on the windows. I've had them enter people's homes and cars through open windows. There was one case years ago, northern part of Pennsylvania, that always kind of stuck in my mind. A woman told me she was in the kitchen one morning, the window was open, and one of these little spheres flew in, is gliding around the kitchen, and her reaction was she grabbed her broom and started striking it, and she said it broke into two identical little spheres. They floated around and went back out the window.
Wow, that's amazing. And what, if you don't mind me interjecting real quick, it's really interesting to me that you brought this up, because this is reminiscent of an experience my father-in-law had. My wife and I both are from the state of Mississippi originally. We were born and raised there, and her dad was driving around one time, and this is right before he was unfortunately killed in a car accident. And he said that when he was driving, that then a small, bright orb-looking thing flew into his car and just kind of parked itself in the passenger seat. This is not the first time I've heard people mention about these little tiny objects. I've even heard of like small metallic devices or something infiltrating people's homes. Have you heard of anything like that as well?
I didn't hear the last part. It's something about the homes you kind of cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I was saying was I've heard some accounts of people having these metallic devices, or like little odd hovering devices, or little tiny round things that would go into people's houses. Have you heard of any accounts like that as well?
Oh yeah, I've had them inside of people's homes. And I've had cases where they just went right through the walls of the house. But, yeah, I've had them hover near people's beds. I've had them hover over people's beds, right in front of them. And, you talk about that incident in the car. Here's a case we had back in July of 2012. This was outside of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. It's up around State College. It was a beautiful afternoon. It was around 5 o'clock in the evening. This fellow has a nice big truck. He's riding down the road at a pretty good rate of speed. And it was just a joyful ride that afternoon. And all of a sudden, he happens to look at the passenger side window, and there's this white translucent solid round object about a diameter of a softball that's pacing the vehicle. Now, it wasn't real luminous, though. And he said the sphere may have been a little more oval than a softball in shape. It paced the vehicle as it moved, then floated into the cab through the open window. And as he watched, the object drop slowly to the floorboard, then slowly moved towards the driver along the floor. The witness was able to see through the sphere and noticed the surface of the object appeared to be crisscrossed and divided by a line about a quarter-inch wide. And the man said it looked similar to a vein that was darker than the object and somewhat of a gray color. And anyhow, he had to take his foot off the accelerator as he was concentrating on the object going down the road, and the object moved very slowly along the floor, then proceeded to the hump in the middle of the floorboard, continued to move towards the driver's foot. When it reached his right foot, it suddenly stopped, reversed direction, and became centered on the hump. The object then departed the truck by passing through the seat, the back of the cab, and out the bed of the truck. Can you imagine that?
That's incredible. And like I said, not only do I believe that this probably happened, but one of my father-in-law, before he was killed, unfortunately, in a car accident, had the same experience. My father, who's from Kansas, he's also had something kind of similar to that happen. But at any rate, I think that this is some phenomenon that I haven't really gotten to the research. This is fascinating, but please continue.
And now, again, I mentioned these things are generally spherical, but that's not always the case. And here's a great report from Fayette City, PA, in Fayette County in October 2017. And this occurred early morning hours, and this man got up early to warm up his wife's car. It was cold out. And as he walked down the steps, he looked towards her car, and he sees something about 10 to 12 feet away by the right bumper. So this is all illuminated where the car is parked. You can see it really well. The lights were on. The area around the car was real bright. And he said he sees this object. He said it was very hard to describe. It's about 2 feet tall, shaped like a haystack. And the object was translucent, shiny, in a milky white color. There were vertical ribs that seemed to be the superstructure that looked like chrome straws that could be seen through the translucent structure. The object was silent, gliding about 1 to 2 inches off the ground, and it was motionless when he first saw it. Whatever the object was, after several seconds, it must have sensed he was there. He's only like 6 feet away from this thing. It suddenly zoomed extremely fast across the driveway to the left side of the car, then made a perfect right angle along the driver's side of the car into the dark area and was never seen again.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
We had Daryl Sims on this program earlier in the year, and we got into a brief conversation about orbs, and what he's had some of his people, his witnesses that he's worked with in the past, who's gotten photographs of these orbs. And when you look at these photographs, you can sometimes see a distinct face in them. Have you seen that before?
I have seen different pictures of them. And again, we look at these things scientifically. And a lot of things, we receive a lot of pictures, a lot of videos in. And I can tell you there's some areas which are somewhat similar to the phenomenon of the Skinwalker Ranch that's been going for years here in Pennsylvania. And I can tell you there's one area that's very active, and I can tell you they have some very, very good close-up video footage, including night vision of one of these mysteries, balls of light very low. So there's some really good details of pictures. But I've seen a number of these orb pictures, and some of them are very interesting, and you cannot find an explanation. There's one of the fellows that I'm involved with, one of the volunteers, is a very good photo analyst, and he's very scientific. He's very open-minded, but he looks for explanations. And I've seen some things that look like different things on some of the orbs, and some of these apparently are related to the lens system, to the electronics within the device that are taking the picture, and they can produce some odd effects. There's a lot of pictures come in that look strange, but many of them there's an explanation for, not in all cases. So, again, I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but I think some of these things are explainable, some things are not.
Absolutely. Now, as far as these cases that you have investigated, and this is kind of getting into the Bigfoot territory, have you ever had any cases that you investigated where people had a Bigfoot encounter and had some UFO activity in or around that area?
Oh yeah. Well, this is what I got involved in many years ago before people heard about this. I started writing about this back in the early 70s. And this is going to take a few minutes to try to explain to you because it's very, very detailed, and we could spend a lot of time talking about just some of these cases. But so 1973 comes around here in Pennsylvania, and first we had the biggest UFO wave ever documented. It started January 1st, continued to the last day of the year. In 1973, there were hundreds and hundreds of UFO reports coming in. And you got to remember, back in 1973, you didn't have the communications like we have today. So many people would initially call the police or the newspapers to report or ask if anybody else saw anything unusual. And again, when 73 comes around, in some cases, when people would report these things, those departments would refer the cases over to my group to investigate. And so you have all these UFO reports in 1973. And again, in many cases, even going back then and through today, many UFO reports, when you take the time to properly investigate them, many are determined to be either natural or man-made in origin. There's many misidentifications. However, there have been hundreds of cases I've investigated you could not easily dismiss, you could not easily find an explanation for. Some of these are very, very detailed, close-range UFO encounter reports. But so go back to 73. Some of those sightings were of large structured objects close to the ground. We had reports of these things back in those days that were hovering near cars, hovering over highways, We had incidents in populated areas. We had landing reports. I mean, it was just amazing, some of the UFO incidents that were coming in. So we were busy just trying to keep up with all these UFO cases all year. And then the summer of 73 occurs. And that's when we had the largest Bigfoot outbreak ever documented anywhere. That went on for months and months into 1974. And I can tell you, we've had Bigfoot sighting reports here in Pennsylvania every year since then. And but nothing like what we're talking about in 73 and the 74. So many of these Bigfoot sightings were in daylight. Many of them were at extremely close range. We're talking 5, 10, 20 feet away from people.
Wow.
So there was no way there were misidentifications. In a lot of cases, my teams would be out within minutes to hours at a location where an incident occurred. And we would find, in some cases, some very fascinating physical evidence. So you got to remember now, in my team, we had scientists, we had engineers, we had technicians, we had police officers, a lot of people who were trained and experienced to investigate and gather information, which is what we were doing. So anyhow, all this stuff's going on for months and months. And some strange things began to come to our attention. One of the first things was that we get out to some of these areas, and there'd be trails of footprints. And some of these were very large, unusual-looking footprints with a very big stride between them. But as you see these trail of tracks under different ground conditions, including later in snow, they would abruptly end and stop, and they were gone. And there was no reason in the world for those tracks to stop. There should have been more tracks. That made no sense. Well, then reports began to get even stranger. People were reluctantly telling us, even in daylight, they'd see a Bigfoot standing in a certain place, and instantaneously it would vanish and reappear somewhere else. And then things got stranger and stranger. That's when we began to see a pattern. We would have, for example, a UFO sighting in a particular area. Within minutes to hours or days later, we have a Bigfoot sighting or vice versa. And then we had just amazing incidents that are very well documented with UFOs and Bigfoot seen together at the same time and place. And by the way, we're having a big storm just hitting here now, so if we lose power, that's what happened. But anyhow, one of these cases, going back to 73, this is north of Pittsburgh, September 73. There's two women waiting for a friend to pick them up out in the country. They see this about 7, 8 foot tall, hair-covered Bigfoot, hair-covered creature with white hair, running across the road towards the woods, but in one of its hands, it's carrying a glowing ball of light.
Wow.
And a short time later, an object came across the sky, projected a beam of light down into the woods where the creature ran into. So that was one of the early reports that made us wonder, like, what is going on here? And then things got much stranger. And there were so many reports which began to indicate that we're dealing with something that is far beyond just an unusual, unknown animal species, which is what I thought Bigfoot always was from the time I got involved. I thought from the reports I was looking into and what I had heard that we're dealing with some type of unknown primate. Well, anyhow, there was one case in particular, and again, we could talk for hours about this case. The brief synopsis about the case, I read this whole thing up in my Silent Invasion book, all the details. It's probably one of the weirdest cases ever documented. But it was October 25th, 1973. This is up in Fayette County again. And there have been a lot of UFO reports coming in on my hotline that day from many different areas. But about 10:30 that night, a state trooper calls me from the Uniontown Barracks up in Fayette County. And he told me he had just came back from investigating this multiple witness incident of a huge UFO that landed on a farm. But there was more to it. And he said he thought that there was something possibly still on the farm. He wanted to know if I could send up a team as soon as possible to that area to investigate it. Well, it's late at night, but we did. We got our equipment together. We had our radios and our radiation gear and other equipment, and we found our way up to Fayette County. And what we found out was at about 9 o'clock, there were about 15 people in that farming area that sees this object. It's about as big as a barn. It's a big red sphere. It's about 100 feet off the ground and hovering and slowly moving downward. And anyhow, the farmer's son was just coming out to visit his family on that farm, and he sees these people standing outside looking at this thing, and he sees it. So he goes to another location which would give him a better view, and it looks like this big round thing is going to land on his dad's pasture. So there were two young boys, and they decide they want to go up and see what this thing is, so they decide they're going to do that, and they stop over his dad's farm. He grabs a 30-06 and a handful of ammunition, and he didn't realize it right at that point, but when he later, as he got closer to the area and pulled the ammo out, he found out he had two tracers. So he had two tracer bullets, so you just get that luminous path as you fire those tracers.
Right.
And as they're riding down the farm road, first thing you notice, the dogs are on the air just going completely crazy. The second thing was they hear this high-pitched whining noise, then they hear these baby crying sounds. And they finally get down closer to where the pasture would be. They angle their truck. They have the headlights on so they can see their way up the hill. And they notice it looks like something's causing the power to drain, and the headlights are very dim, which is not, they'd never saw that before. And they're walking their way up the hill. When they get up on top of the hill, they're in the pasture, and about 250 feet away, they're just amazed because here's this huge object on the ground or right above it. But now it's not a complete round object. It's not a complete sphere. It's like a half a sphere. It's a big white dome that's huge, making this loud whining noise. And they're just staring there in amazement watching this thing, and suddenly their attention is drawn about 75 feet away. There's a barbed wire fence, and along the barbed wire fence are these two huge, hairy Bigfoot creatures, and another way to describe it, one in front of the other, moving very slowly. The one in front is about 8 feet tall. The one behind is about 7 feet tall. They have very long, dark, kind of brownish, grayish, matted hair hanging off the body. They have no neck. Their arms are hanging down past their knees almost to the ground. They're that long. They have luminous, large, glowing green eyes, and they're making that whining, baby crying sound. And the one boy is so frightened he runs out of the field. And short time later, that other boy starts yelling, shoot him, shoot him. So he fires a shot. The first shot's a tracer. He got that luminous trail. But when he fires the second shot, which is the second tracer, here's what happens. The largest of the two creatures makes this loud, whining, baby crying sound, reaches out as though to grab that tracer, and the same moment it does that, that huge object in the field that's making that loud sound suddenly vanishes and disappears. It doesn't take off the ground. It's just physically gone. So most of the luminosity is gone, the sound's gone, the object's gone. The creatures turn around, start walking back slowly along the fence line, back towards the woods. The guy's firing live ammo from his 30-06 at the creatures, mainly aiming at that larger creature, which he said he knew he hit. And he told me for years, he said, I'd never forget how that creature with those glowing green eyes kept staring at me as I'm pumping live ammo into it with my 30-06, and there's no effect on them whatsoever.
That is so bizarre.
So they run back to the vehicle, and they go back to the farmhouse, take the family to a neighbor, call the state police. When the trooper arrives 45 minutes later, they go up in the troop car looking for evidence, and the trooper told me, he said, when they got up into the field where the object had been on the ground, the whole area is self-luminescent and glowing, about 100 feet or more in diameter. He said that it extended up about a foot off the ground, and if he had a newspaper, he thought he could read a newspaper from the glow coming off of that area. So that's the short part of the story. It got stranger and stranger during the night, but that was the case that convinced me that we're dealing with something much more unusual than just an unknown animal.
So it seems, Stan, it definitely seems that, and it seems like the more things that we uncover with Bigfoot, the more questions that come up. It really does, and there's so much paranormal phenomenon that seems to be more and more associated with Bigfoot sightings. I think this is a pretty good spot to take a break. But when we come back, I'd like to talk about some more of your cases and find out what's going on in your world currently. And this is the Paranormal Pennsylvania with Stan Gordon. You're listening to Project Stargate. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Project Stargate. We have the Paranormal Pennsylvania Files with Stan Gordon. Stan, welcome back. And we were talking about Bigfoot and orbs and UFOs, but there's much more to this story. Please continue.
Oh, yeah, and again, there's so many things that I've uncovered now over the years that indicate that there's a lot of very strange aspects to the Bigfoot phenomena. But it was one case in particular that happened during that wave we talked about in 73, 74 that convinced me that whatever we're dealing with Bigfoot, it's much stranger than an unknown animal. And for a lack of a better term, I think we're dealing with something that has a physical and a non-physical component to it, which is why there's been no bodies found. And they may very well be, again, possibly something that's interdimensional. So I'll tell you about this story. This was February 6, 1974. And some of your listeners will remember the time period. There was a big national trucker strike going on across the country. There was a lot of violence on the highways in different states. There was gas rationing. A lot of people remember that. So back here in Pennsylvania, because of what was going on, the National Guard and the state police were patrolling together. So you had some members of both teams that were responded to this particular case. So this occurred way in the mountains up in Fayette County, up near Ohio in that general area. And the story focused on a woman that lived there all her life out in the woods. She knew animals well. She was a good shot. And she had a little cabin home. When she was watching TV that evening, as normal, and everything was fine, and she began to hear this noise on her little front porch. She had some empty pop cans out there, and something's knocking those pop cans all around. And 2 or 3 weeks before, she had a pack of wild dogs came through. And she figured probably those dogs are back, so I'll just grab my shotgun, I'll shoot over their head and scare them away. So she decides to do that. She grabs her shotgun, loads one chamber, walks over to the wall, turns on, has her hand on the switch, and steps out the front, opens up the front door and steps out and turns on the switch, and the light comes on, and there's no dogs. But right in front of her, I believe it was about 6 feet away, is this huge hair-covered creature that as soon as she turns the light on, it puts its arm straight up over its head. And when I interviewed her numerous times, she never, ever called it a Bigfoot. She said it looked like a great big hairy ape, is what she told me. And she sees this thing, and what does she do? She aims her shotgun and fires right into it. She said there's this brilliant flash of light, like the flash on a camera, and the creature physically vanishes and disappears right in front of her.
Wow.
Well, that's arresting enough, but her in-laws lived 100 feet away. They hear the gunshot. So they called her and asked her what she's shooting at, and she tells them. The son-in-law grabs a sidearm. He starts walking down the road towards her cabin. As he gets closer, he said he's surrounded by 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire, starts shooting at him, runs into the cabin, and right around that time period, there's this very large luminous object, they said, like a big Christmas ornament hovering over the woods at the same time.
Wow, that's incredible.
That's when they called the state police. So I talked to the primary investigator who was there, and he said by the time they all found this place way up in the mountains, they said everything was gone, but he said something very strange had happened up there based on the animal reactions. And I don't know if I mentioned this to you or not when we started. In all the years I've been doing this, I have never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot myself, surprising to most people. I've seen a lot of evidence, but I've never seen one.
I was actually wondering that.
Yeah. But what I have seen is the animal reactions. And very commonly, when Bigfoot is close vicinity to even the most ferocious dogs, in most cases the dogs are like paralyzed in fear. They don't bark, they shake, they cower, they hide. They act very odd, even sometimes for days later. And animals react similarly as well. They don't do their normal behavior when the stuff is going on. But anyhow, I talked to that trooper, and he said when he got up to the scene, everything was quiet. Those dogs didn't make a sound. They had several big dogs. I think he said, one of the big dogs was in a pen. It wasn't making a sound or moving. I think it was an Eskimo Spitz, and he opened up the door, tried to pull the dog out, and the dog wouldn't even move. And now I couldn't get gas the next morning, but when my team and I got up there early the next morning, dogs were barking, everything was back to normal. That was the case, among others, that suggested we're dealing with something that's both physical and non-physical. It's very, very weird phenomenon, and it's much deeper than this. I have found some correlation between this and other cryptids that are being reported. It's a very strange phenomena. I think whatever we're dealing with right now is so beyond our present scientific understanding that nobody understands what's going on, including the government. I think they've been aware of some of these things for a long, long time, but I think they'll find out also that whatever we're dealing with, this is far beyond anybody's understanding at this point.
I can concur with that. That's what it seems to me. I've heard during the course of my research, when I started researching the paranormal many years ago, I started researching various paranormal subjects because throughout my life I've had many, many different types of paranormal phenomenon, including many UFO sightings, and just all kinds of different paranormal phenomena such as poltergeist and stuff like that. One thing that I've ran across during the course of learning about the Bigfoot phenomenon is I've heard of a phenomenon called I've heard people call it the Backwoods Poltergeist. That's commonly associated with Bigfoot. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not that exact term, but I'm familiar with the fact that sometimes people who have experienced certain phenomena in their area, on their property, they've experienced other paranormal phenomena as well, while some of this cryptid activity is going on.
Wow, that's really telling. I mean, what could we possibly be dealing with? I mean, there's got to be some sort of interdimensional entity of some sort. But please continue.
Well, one of the patterns that I found many, many years ago, it continues to be reported. Many low-level, close-range UFO encounters and many encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids often occur in the vicinity of high-energy sources. So you have many reports around high-tension power lines, power plants, radio communication towers, gas wells, gas lines, railroad tracks, bodies of water, things like that. That's very, very common. And, a lot of the phenomena that we experienced in 73, I started writing about it in the early 70s, is very similar to what we later heard about on the Skinwalker Ranch. And in more recent years, not only here in Pennsylvania, but around the country, there are more and more specific properties, locations where there seems to be this phenomena, for whatever reason, seems to kind of target or focus on. And these incidents can last for weeks, months, or years. And so when we're talking about what's going on in these properties, we're talking about everything from the balls of light to UFOs to strange footprints to paranormal phenomena, apparitions, haunting-type things, Bigfoot sightings, cryptid encounters, sometimes more than one type of cryptid on the property. All kind of very weird things are going on, various type of electromagnetic effects, this strange phenomena. And we had an incident, an ongoing series of incidents that happened down here in western PA. This is 1981-82, when a lot of it was going on for a long time for miles in this area, and a lot of neighbors and people were experiencing things. And from what I recall, it all began after previously, during one afternoon, I think it was actually in 79, I was told that an object fell from the sky into the wooded area, and soon after that, things began to periodically happen. And then on 81-82, things got very, very busy. In fact, this series of events actually made the local newspaper and TV in this area. It was so unusual. But they were seeing not only Bigfoot, but they were having an outbreak of Black Panther sightings. And I find this very intriguing. I wrote about this in my last book, Astonishing Encounters, and some very, very weird things I found out with the Black Panther cases, too. So, when we're discussing what people describe as Black Panthers, we're talking about an animal they see in the zoo, generally a leopard or jaguar, will not common in this part of the world. And these sightings have been going on for years and years. And sometimes when you have these unusual outbreaks of phenomena, you have more than one cryptid show up, and sometimes their Black Panthers are being seen. And it's not only in the United States this is going on, it's around other countries as well we hear about. but I've uncovered some very weird things with other cryptids, including Black Panthers. So let me tell you about one case that really sticks out.
Yes, sir.
And this is from 1983 up in Fayette County. So this fellow's getting home late. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning. His car's overheating. He pulls into his driveway, and he goes in to get some antifreeze. He opens the hood of the vehicle, and he hears a growl. So he looks around, and he hears this growl again, and you look, and there's a large tomcat about 20 feet away, a big, large black cat about 20 feet away, and it's growling. So he doesn't pay much attention to it. A few seconds later, he hears the second growl, but this time, when he looks, he's shocked because this large house cat has now physically grown about another foot in size.
Holy cow.
So he throws the empty antifreeze jug at the animal, which he hits it, and it growls fiercely at him, like it's going to attack him, takes 2 or 3 steps backward, then growls again as it moves up an illuminated roadway past several homes. He runs inside and grabs his pistol, and he comes back out, and he took a shot at it, but what he now realizes is that now that even bigger house cat now has physically grown to the size of a black panther, he said, like you see in the zoo. And he said it's growling at him and has very bright glowing yellow eyes with a long tail, and it looks right at him, and as he's watching it, it physically vanishes and disappears right in front of him.
Wow, that's incredible. That is really amazing. That's incredible. Have you had any have you had a lot of reports of Dogman over the last several decades?
I have had some reports, and so going back to 1973, and once again, there's so much detail from 73 and so many bizarre, weird cases, and we didn't even get into details. I mean, in my Silent Invasion book, I go into great detail about these things, but here's what I want to mention. When you read that, what's in the book, you had that massive Bigfoot outbreak, and there were a lot of typical Bigfoot reports, 6 to 9 foot tall, covered with hair, long arms, no neck, that type of thing. But you had some variations in some of the reports. There were some that were taller and thinner. You had some that were shorter and more muscular. And then we had some cases where people were literally within feet of these things. And they got a very good look at the face. And some of them described them as looking as the head covered with thick hair, more like a wolf or a dog, with luminous glowing eyes and fang-like teeth. And some of them some of these things would go down on 4s and get up on 2s. So there was some similarity to some of the Dogman reports, even going back to 73. And I can think of a couple really amazing cases like that, but one in particular I remember early morning, must have been around 3 o'clock in the morning. This was in a very heavily wooded area back then between Greensburg and Jeanette. And this home, this woman was visiting friends. She was at this place. The house was a very low foundation. So it was low enough that somebody could easily caught up on the roof. But she's 3 o'clock in the morning, she's in the restroom. She's sitting right there. Right in front of her is the window. She hears these odd sounds outside. She couldn't make out what they were. And suddenly, this hideous face is in the window looking directly at her. And my power's starting to go out, so we might have a problem from the storm.
That's okay.
Anyhow, this thing is looking right. She's looking at the glowing eyes, the thing-like teeth. She's basically hysterical. She runs out there screaming. She tells her friends about what just happened. They called the state police. The state police connect her to me. They send a trooper out. They find some possible footprints out there. She's so scared, she made him early morning take her to her home several miles away. Here's the interesting thing that you rarely hear about, but I have more cases of this. Within the hour at the home she went to, the same or a similar Bigfoot showed up there.
Wow.
It gets stranger and stranger. And there's incidents of electromagnetic effects with not only UFOs, but with Bigfoot. And this is something many people have not heard about. It's not very common, but it's been reported not only again in PA, but around the country over the years. So, going back to the 50s and 60s and other years, you have reports of these large, solid objects hovering low over vehicles that when the objects are close by, the cars begin to lose power, or the headlights begin to go out and get very dim, and the object moves off and the power comes back on. We have had incidents where a Bigfoot walks out in front of a car, and while the creature's close by, the car begins to lose power, and the creature walks off and the power comes back on. So that's another very interesting thing. And remember that energy connection we talked about earlier.
Yes, sir. That's something I've seen so much of in all these different types of paranormal phenomenon. A lot of them, I would say the overwhelming majority at least, does involve electronic interference.
Yeah, it's very, very intriguing, that's for sure. And the interesting thing, we talked about the mini UFOs, the small spheres of light over the years we talked about, and we talked about these earlier. See, here's your Bigfoot connection. In more recent years, and again, not only in PA, but across the country, you're getting a lot more reports from Bigfoot researchers now, investigators, who are out in areas that have a history of Bigfoot activity, and are reporting seeing strange luminous phenomena or these small spheres of light low to the ground in the trees coming near them. That something is going on more and more and more. And this, let me give you an interesting case that happened outside of Pittsburgh here. This would have been in May of 2019. So it's early morning, and this fellow's looking out, he gets up and he's looking out his back window, which is all woods back there, and he sees what appears to be a small Bigfoot. And we have reports on these small ones, about 4 to 5 feet tall, covered with dark hair. He sees this thing with its long arms walking across the field towards the woods, and it enters one particular area of the woods. About 3 seconds later, at the exact spot where the Bigfoot entered the woods, a bright sphere of light about 3 or 4 inches in diameter suddenly appeared. He said it was similar looking, directly in the front of a flashlight. It was about 4 feet off the ground. The light moved a short distance for about 3 seconds, then vanished. 4 to 5 seconds later, it reappears about 10 feet away, but this time the small sphere emits a bright beam of light about 10 to 12 feet long. It lasts for several seconds, then it vanishes and disappears, and that's it.
Wow. That's really interesting. Now, I've heard you mention many times in the past about Thunderbirds. Is that something that's relevant now? Are you still getting sightings of those?
Yeah, actually, we just had, in the last few months, we just had some very, very interesting cases. They're on my website, if people can look at stangordon.info, info. But yeah, back in, I believe it was April and May, we had a number of sightings in this area. We've had a history of sightings here in western Pennsylvania. And there's one very interesting case that took place in April of this year down in eastern Pennsylvania. And they can read the whole report. I mean, this is actually a case, and just to encapsulate it, this person and another witness, and this just occurred several weeks ago in the western part of the state, almost the same kind of thing. They see this huge flying creature, huge flying oversized bird with some strange details to it in daylight. In both cases, they came down within 10 feet, glided down, not even, their wings weren't even moving, just glided down, and in both cases, these things turned their head and made eye contact with the witness, which is very interesting.
Wow, that's creepy.
Well, they thought so, too. They were very, very shook up over it, let me tell you.
I could only imagine. Do you think these are like surviving pterodactyls or something interdimensional or something we don't even possibly understand?
Well, there are we're just talking about a few of the weird cryptid type things going on. I have numerous type of things I've been dealing with. Some of these things right now I've been dealing with and interviewing people with are so bizarre. I haven't even talked about some of these things yet, but they're credible people. They want no publicity. They're very shook over what they saw, and some of these cases are similar things being reported around the country as well. You cannot possibly have so many type of unknown creatures. It's impossible. You can't have all these huge flying creatures and all these Bigfoot and the out-of-place animals and all kind of other winged humanoids and gliding creatures, and these other skinny, hairless humanoid creatures are being seen in the last few years in Pennsylvania and around the country, and all these things going on. You can't have them all. It's impossible. However, you've got so many credible people who don't know each other who are giving us the same details. You can't dismiss the reports. The only thing that makes any sense is that we're dealing with something which we don't understand, that comes in and out of our physical reality, leaves evidence at times. Sometimes they look physically solid, sometimes they're not completely physically solid, and they're gone. They come and they go. And I don't have the answers for it. We can only speculate, but there's something going on. You can't dismiss all these reports.
No, you can't. Not at all. And what the things, it seems like when we think we're close to getting an answer to something, here comes like 5 more questions. It's like a never-ending puzzle.
It is. You know, like I said, the more I know about it, the stranger it is. I said years and years ago, the phenomena is so strange it protects itself. Because who's going to believe it? Unless you experience yourself, it's very hard for most people to believe. And so many people, I mean, I know people from 30, 40 years ago that I'm still in touch with, whose lives have been completely changed by what they experienced. And it's just very, very bizarre. And another cryptid that I've been dealing with now for several years, and now these are showing up around the country. Very intriguing. If you'd like me to talk about some of those,
please do. I want to hear. We want to hear whatever you got going on for sure.
Well, this is another phenomena, and this involves a rather tall, very sickly-looking, skinny, hairless humanoid creature that's been reported. And this report was very fascinating. This is back in 2017 here in Pennsylvania. The witness was a police officer on patrol. And they had contacted me about what he saw, and he said, I have never in my life seen anything like this. I mean, he just, you know, he was beside himself. But anyhow, so he's riding down that evening, patrolling a rural area that he commonly patrolled, and he sees this ball of light on the ground. It's kind of a dull white light. And he's thinking, I don't remember ever seeing any type of artificial lighting around there. So he stops his patrol car, and suddenly this ball of light rises up from the ground, and he realizes this is the head of this very strange being, at least 6 feet or taller. He said it was tall and almost skeletal thin. He said that he thinks that when he first saw it, had been lying on its belly on the ground with his head facing the road, and then it stood up facing, turning, and he just saw the dull glow from the head area illuminating the upper part of the body. And he said when it turned, he said, I never saw anything move so quick in my life. He said it was the most incredible speed. He said it was faster than anything I've ever seen. It was there and then it was gone. And that's interesting because that is almost the same words that witnesses have mentioned to me when they've seen Bigfoot in some cases, where it just suddenly, they said it's like watching a science fiction movie, that it suddenly appears and then it just disappears, it's gone. But he said that the head was about 8 to 10 inches in diameter, kind of egg-shaped, but pretty round, and the light was illuminating the shoulders, the top of the chest, and sections of the arm. He could not see any hands. The chest looked about 18 inches across. The waist appeared to be small, but the arms were unusually long. The long limbs looked skeletal with no muscle mass. The skin tone appeared to be a dull grayish blue. The witness could not see any facial features. And he pulled his vehicle up after the creature left, put a spotlight on. There was no tracks or anything. So interestingly, so that's in August. And then in September, I get another report from another person. And again, I can't remember how many. This is probably 25, 30 miles away. I can't remember, in a different area. And that evening, this person's outside and notices this strange-looking object hovering low in the sky, like a big disc with various colors on it that's moving up and down. And soon after they see the object and it's still there, she hears this very bizarre, strange sound emitting from the woods. And she's familiar with the wildlife around. It said it sounded like an owl, but it was very, very loud and steady, more like an angry type of sound. And while the UFO is still there, hovering, suddenly she sees this figure approaching from the woods, from down the street. She figured it was a neighbor, somebody coming up the road. But as it gets closer, she realizes this is not a person. This is something about 6 foot tall. The head was kind of egg-shaped. The color looked odd and gave the impression it was sickly and in poor health. It looked to have the very light cream, the ivory color. Could not see any good facial features on it. The body was very thin and hairless, but wider around the shoulders, about 20 inches across. Could not see the arms or hands. The legs were straight and thin, but they seemed to be bent outward from the knees. So anyhow, this person ran to her home, and when she came out, everything was gone. And then I get another report from another county from a man. So this was the fall of 2018, and this guy lived deep in the woods. His home's deep in the woods. I had been there, and familiar with the deer because he lives with the deer, basically, and he's hearing these bipedal sounds that didn't sound right. So he goes down to his house, and he's sitting there at the dinner table, 10 feet away from the back door that has no drapes on it, so it's unobstructed. And as he's sitting in there, suddenly this humanoid-shaped being with his hands and knees staring directly at the witness, and this creature, he said, looked like almost like a skeleton with all gray skin. It was so thin. He said it had gray, bony legs. The legs looked similar to the back legs of a greyhound. The arms were longer than normal, bony and hairless. The head was round. The neck was small. The head was on shoulders. The mouth was closed, but the eyes were glowing a dull yellow color. And he said this thing would have been at least 6 or 7 feet tall. He could see its spine protruding as it moved. He was stunned, and he said the thing was down on all fours, scampering around the house, and was gone. Those are just an example, and there have been numerous somewhat similar reports all across the country in recent years.
Wow, that's so bizarre. Some of the stuff that is new to me, and I'm just so fascinated with it. What if you had to pick one case off the top of your head of all the cases you've investigated? What would you say is the most fascinating and the most bizarre case you've ever investigated?
Oh, my gosh, I couldn't begin. But the one, of course, that I always think about is that case we talked about earlier, October 25th, 73, with the UFO on the ground with 2 Bigfoot.
Yes.
And the things that happened later. That was the case. But, you know, there's more to that story, and you'll find this interesting. So over the years, we would do follow-up investigations with witnesses of really important cases just to see anything new had happened, anything had happened in their lives or anything. And so years later, and particularly with the main witness, the farmer's son who was involved, he was the primary person involved in the case. And we had never hypnotized him. And there was a famous psychiatrist, Dr. Berthold Schwartz, who was involved in a lot of this research back in the 70s, spent a week up here on his own time interviewing all the people, went away convinced these people all telling the truth. And he was never hypnotized, and we never did. But years later, we were thinking about possibly hypnotizing him. So we sit down with him this one day, and we're suggesting this to him, and he said, "Why do you want to hypnotize me again?" And my associate and I look at each other like, and what are you talking about? And he said, "Yeah, you're guys from your group. You hypnotized me years ago." And we knew that wasn't us. And he said, "Well, tell us about it." And he said, "Yeah, during that time it was going on, your teams and people kept coming up interviewing me." And he said one day these 2 fellows showed up. One was in a dark suit. The other was in Air Force uniform. The guy in the Air Force uniform had a briefcase. And he said they wanted him to sit down and tell them all the details of what he saw that night, what happened with the UFOs and the Bigfoot in the field. And then surprisingly, he said, the Air Force officer out of his briefcase pulled all kind of photographs out of UFOs and Bigfoot. And it was one I remember him telling me it was a Bigfoot carrying a dead pig under its arm, climbing a fence, I believe it was in Georgia. And he wanted the witness to point out what UFOs and what Bigfoot looked similar to what he saw. And then they hypnotized him, apparently, and they told him they believed everything he said, and they said they would be in touch with him, and he never heard from them again. And, of course, we tried to track them down. And, of course, Project Blue Book, the Air Force investigation, closed down officially in January of 1970. So they were officially not supposed to be out there investigating, so we couldn't find any records. And whoever those mystery men were, we don't know. But there was also interesting things going on during that massive wave in '73. One of the things was I received a phone call, I believe it was September of '73, from a gentleman who told me he worked for the government, that they were very interested in the investigations that I was doing with my team, that I was given the name of a laboratory in Washington, D.C., I was given the name of a contact, an address, and a phone number in the event we came up with a body or something that's significant. And I never needed to call the number, but I had it. But I believe it wasn't long after, excuse me, I got a call from one of the congressman's office, and they had been getting a lot of calls from the public about what was going on. People were getting concerned, and they asked if they could meet with me. So 2 people from the office came and met with me. They were very interested. They were very supportive. I kept in touch with them for quite a long time. I told them about the phone call I got, and I showed them the phone number, and they checked on it, and they confirmed it was a government number. And so that was interesting. But then there was another incident happened, and this happened at a very large mobile home community near the Chestnut Ridge out in Derry Township, where there have been multiple UFO and Bigfoot sightings going on. And in the one particular evening this was going on, my team and I were at another town where we got a call from the state police that there had been an incident down in Harmony, PA. My team went down there, and this man had just cut his grass. He went in the house to take a shower. His dog was outside on a chain. When he came out, his dog's going crazy, and he goes to look. About 45 feet away, here's this huge Bigfoot in his garden standing there, and the dog's going nuts. And they called the police, and my team went down. And we got down there, and we found some interesting evidence out in the garden where the thing had been, some tracks and whatever. And while we're there, we get a radio call that the police up in Derry Township requested us to come up to this mobile home community. There had been a Bigfoot incident up there, and they wanted us to come up as soon as possible. So that was, I can't remember, 25, 30 miles away, and we found our way up to that area. We got there, and we found out that evening, these people were in a mobile home. They heard something scratching at the end of the trailer. Their dog was outside. It was whining real strangely, wouldn't bark, just whining. Their power was going on and off in their trailer. And they opened up the back door, and here's this tall, dark creature standing there. And the person screams, and the thing runs between the mobile homes, and several people see it. And again, I mentioned about the power going on and off. Well, anyhow, the police got there before we did, and they found some possible footprints, and they preserved them there for us to look at when we got there. And when we got there, we're searching the air, and we found that that heavy-duty electrical supply line that goes from the power box underground to the trailer had been physically pulled up out of the ground.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, an energy connection. Again, that was interesting. And so that was interesting. But here's what goes on. A few days later, I get an emergency. Back in those days, you had a real operator and a dial phone, not like cell phones today.
Right.
And I get an emergency call from an operator that's breaking into my phone call from the person, the woman at that mobile home. And from what I'm remembering now, she called to tell me that she had found some hair out in that area where the creature had been, and she wanted to give it to me, but something odd had happened. She said this man showed up with an Ohio license plate. Several people were there outside at the time. They were looking at the footprints, and there was, back in those days, remember we had the Polaroid cameras. You put the film cartridge in, you got the picture right away?
Absolutely.
All right, so this young boy's out there taking photographs of the footprints, and this guy shows up, and he starts asking all kind of questions. And apparently the little boy is talking, Brady. He said, look, I took a picture. And the guy grabbed the picture out of his hand, wriggled it up, put it in his pocket, and said, you made a picture for us. And then went over and destroyed the footprints. And the people started screaming at him. They said he ran into his car. They said, we're going to call the police. They said he almost turned over getting out of there. And they never saw him again. We never found out who he was.
Did at any point, did any of these these individuals that you've been talking about the past few minutes, do they ever say like, "Hey, we're with Stan," or claim to be in league with you or your team?
I believe in that case, the man told the woman, that's what happened too, that he knew me, and if she gave him the hair samples, he would give them to me. I believe that's what was said. And of course, we never saw those hair samples.
Wow. Men in Black. This is kind of similar to what you're talking about. Have any of your witnesses that you've helped or worked with, have any of them ever had an encounter with the classic iteration of what we call the Men in Black, as far as the very odd characters like they experienced in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, during the Mothman incidents? Have you ever had any cases where people had encounters with these people or whatever they are?
I have heard very, very few. I can tell you, of the thousands and thousands of cases I worked on, that is such a small number. Rarely ever hear about it. And and when we heard about it was years and years ago. It's not something we commonly hear about in more recent years.
What do you think they are? Do you think that they're some kind of beings from another dimension? Do you think they're ETs? Do you think they're humans trying to be using agicality and deception? Or what would your theory be?
I keep an open mind. I don't have the answers. Some of them are pretty odd because some of the cases I heard about, the people hadn't reported the incident yet, and they shut up pretty quickly. So that was kind of interesting. I think in some cases it's possibly could be some type of government agency that was investigating the cases. Some of the other reports are a little more unusual. So again, I don't know. There's a lot of things that go on with these cases we don't have the answers for. All we can do is put down all the data and gather all the information, but there's so many things we don't have the explanations for right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems like I said earlier, it seems like the more efforts we put into looking for answers, instead of getting answers, it seems like we get more questions.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. Yes, it's very, very strange, and these sightings are going on all the time. I deal with these things on a regular basis. I mean, all the time I'm getting reports of current and past reports. I have people today called me I have to get back to, and yeah, these things are going all the time. We get interesting reports in. I mean, we just had a fascinating UFO sighting that happened, a little over a week ago, down in the Mon Valley. So this is probably 30 miles from Pittsburgh, down along the Monongahela River, which there's been activity around there for years and years of all kinds of stuff, from thunderbirds and, again, Bigfoot sightings and UFOs and weird things in the water and all kind of things like that. But one of the witnesses contacted me that evening, and it was a nice evening outside of Pittsburgh that night, and they were sitting outside just enjoying the weather, and they happened to look across the river, and on top of the hill was a tree line, and suddenly they see this large, luminous orange triangular object right above the top of the trees. It moves straight up slowly above the trees and moves to the left and moves to the right, then accelerates up into the clouds, and they didn't see it again. About 10 minutes later, they see a second similar object, but this one began to come from the ground, from the lower level, then up over top of the trees and did exactly the same thing, and went up into the clouds and was gone. But they said you could see the solid shape of the triangular object, but you could see through it, but there was also a solid ball of orange light that was not transparent in the middle of the triangular object. So whether it was attached to it or a separate object pacing it, we don't know. And they said that they made absolutely no sound, and they said they sat there for 2 hours watching the sky, and they never saw them again. And so that's kind of interesting, too. Another thing that's been going on in more recent years is that even in daylight, we're getting reports of these large solid objects entering clouds but never exiting the clouds. So sometimes the clouds vanish and the object's not there. That's been going on more and more. Here's an interesting case from one of my associate researchers, Jim Brown, up in Fayette County, and this was in August of 2019, and So the witness tells, around 4:30 in the afternoon, tells Jim that he sees this large black ball come out of the northwest, flew to a puffy white cloud, and it was the only cloud in the sky at the time. He calls his wife to come out to tell her what happened. They're both sitting on the porch. 5 minutes later, 2 more black balls appeared to come from 2 different directions, flew into the same cloud, and never came out. His wife ran into the house to get a camera, and while she was going, a 4th one came out of the west and entered the cloud. This one was larger than the other 2 and had 4 spikes sticking out of each side. And almost as soon as it entered, the cloud turned a yellow color that seemed to just wash itself out of the sky, and the cloud's gone, and the objects never reappeared.
That's very similar to a case I'm looking into that happened right after the 4th of July in South Carolina. We had about 25 eyewitnesses to this case, and it was very similar to what you described, except this case, it happened in broad daylight, and there was about 20 to 25 eyewitnesses pulled over to the side of the road, and you see this object coming into view, and it seemed like the object was getting close to a cloud, and as it got close to the cloud, it seemed to cloak, for lack of a better term, or blend into its surrounding environment, which would be the cloud. It goes into the cloud, and then this object, when it emerges from the cloud, it's solid black. And not only is it solid black, but it starts morphing in real time. And this was in broad daylight.
Okay. So basically what you're saying, the morphing is it's changing some type of form. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay. So that's exactly right. That's what I've been saying for years. These objects, whatever we're dealing with, and of course, if you've been following the Navy reports, the Pentagon reports, they talk about these objects, and that these things can suddenly appear out of nowhere. They can look physically solid. They can suddenly disappear. I have cases, even daylight in recent years, of large solid objects that suddenly begin to fade away and disappear. But they also can physically change form from one form into another. And again, we have these cases of these large triangles that you can see the solid outline, but they're transparent as they're moving across the sky. So here's a report that I got, and this is on my website, and you can see the sketches from this report of what the witness tried to draw for me of how this object he saw was changing form. So this is June 12th of this year, and I get a phone report from Cambria County, and this witness, who is very familiar with aircraft, he sees this large cigar-shaped object. Initially, he said it was about 200 feet off the ground, shaped like a cigar, had no wings, kind of a white or silver color. The center was a grayish blue. That was at 7:18. At 7:29, he sees it again, and it's at a higher altitude this time. He didn't have a phone camera. He had a very inexpensive older digital camera, and he tried to take several pictures. He got one picture of it. It's on my website, but you can barely see it. It was too small to really do analysis on, but he got a picture. But anyhow, at 11:27 that night, I get another report from Allegheny County outside of Pittsburgh, and this fellow had seen something around 8:30, so it's about an hour. I think it was about an hour after the other fellow had seen the sighting up in Cambria County. So this guy's outside of Pittsburgh, and he sees this dark object approaching from the southwest, and he said it looked like it was hovering about 1,500 feet in the sky. Silent, black in color, was rounded and long, had no lights or windows. He went and got his binoculars and looked like it was about 75 feet in length. And he said, this is what is so hard to believe. He said, I can't explain it well, but he said, while he's watching, he said, the object began to physically change form. He said it looked like it was gelatinous at times, stretching and shrinking, then going back to its original shape. And after a few minutes, that object picked up speed and moved towards the northwest and accelerated towards Butler County.
Wow, that's defying our known laws of physics straight up.
And that's what we're getting. And again, there's so many sightings in populated areas that you just don't hear about. We had this really interesting sighting. I think I went into a little bit of detail earlier. It was February through March of this year. So this is populated areas in southwest PA, mainly all around the greater Pittsburgh area. So we're talking populated suburbs of Pittsburgh. And during that time, we were, for example, and again, you can read the reports on my website, but there was a report of 3 white circular objects in a triangular configuration in Cambria County. Triangular-shaped objects being reported. A large black rectangular object was seen daylight in Bedford County. Reports of large glowing spherical objects seen at low level and close to homes. Bright objects moving straight up to the sky and disappearing. Sightings of small spheres of light are close to the ground. Residents in different areas are reporting unusual luminous lights are being recorded on their game and security cameras. Another researcher from up in Butler County that I was in touch with, Dan Hagman, said he had received numerous reports of incidents in March from that area. Some of his reports are really interesting. I'll read you a couple of them.
Please do.
You see, from March 8th, a witness saw a bright cigar-shaped object in the morning sky. The sky was clear with some puffy clouds. Object did not appear to have any wings or tail. Indicated the object was so bright he had to squint his eyes. The witness, who was familiar with aircraft, stopped his car and got out to get a better look at this thing. The object moved into a cloud but never exited from it. There you go again. But this was really interesting. Man's in his kitchen during the evening. He begins to feel this strange vibration and heard a low rumble. He realized that the sliding glass door to his deck is vibrating. As he looked out the door, he notices a very bright and very large pulsating round object just above the trees in the edge of his yard. The light from the object illuminated his backyard as though it was the middle of the day. He stepped on the deck and was awestruck by what he saw. He felt a tingling sensation, his hair stood up, and he had chill bumps on his body. He called to his wife, and he hurried inside to grab a camera. When he came back, it was gone.
That's a bummer.
So it's just a lot of interesting cases. But there are some historical cases that I have been involved with, and there have been so many, and these are the kind of cases that you cannot easily dismiss. And one of the cases that stand up occurred back September 3rd, 1987, and this is only miles from where I live outside of Greensburg, and what was a very, very busy 4-lane Route 30 by what was in the Green Gate Mall area. And around 8:30 at night, a number of people, including some law enforcement people, they see this huge object passing over high-tension power lines across Route 30, and this thing is about 300 feet long. It's about as long as a football field, and it's only about 300 feet high. It looked like it was about the length of 2 Goodyear blimps, and it was elongated, solid craft with silver or dark gray surface, moving about 50 to 60 miles an hour, no sound, very low, and it was covered with many brilliant lights that were white in color, and there was a bright flashing red light on each end. And the object continued to move across the road where there's a power substation. So suddenly this huge object turns vertical in the sky, and when it does, the power in the area goes off in the mall and the surrounding area. And that evening, there was a major power failure in the annex behind the mall, and when the power company crews went there, I was told they discovered that all 3 of the master fuses in the feed line had been blown. Apparently it's something that's just unheard of. So there was a lot of interest in that particular case. Wow. And so these are cases, there's many cases with electromagnetic effects. And similar with the Bigfoot again, and we have cases with EM effects with Bigfoot on some cases. Another one of my more interesting cases in more recent years, this is June 1st, 2013, also on Route 30, so this is probably, I'm guessing, 8 or 9 miles from where the previous one happened in North Huntington Township. So this is right after 10 o'clock in the evening, and this is a woman who didn't believe in UFOs until this night, and her 3-year-old child, and they're pulling out of a convenience store, and they're heading down Route 30 East, and a woman's on her cell phone, and all of a sudden she has to brake right in the middle of the road, and she said to me, I couldn't believe it, I'm the only one here. There's cars way behind me and way ahead of me, and there's nobody near me when this is going on. She said, I had to brake because here, right in the middle of the road, is this huge object taking up all 4 lanes. And she said, well, actually what happened was her young baby yells, look, Mommy, a flying iPad in the sky. And she's describing this thing. It's about 150 feet away initially, and she said it was completely silent, about 60 feet above the road, looked like mostly rectangular. She said it looked like the gondola of a blimp without the blimp. And she said the length appeared to be extended over the east and westbound lanes of the highway. It was about 55 feet long, about 35 to 40 feet tall. It had numerous, really unusual, there were 2 tiers of lights on it that were just very strange, completely different than navigational lighting. So anyhow, she's on the cell phone talking. She has to pass underneath it to go home. So when she does, she loses her Bluetooth cell phone signal. She notices that the digital display in her car on the dash for the clock, the temperature, the airbag, the Bluetooth, all that is dead. The FM radio she had on in the car, the FM radio signal goes out. She lost her cell phone signal, and she tries to take a picture with her iPhone, and it would not let her go into the photo mode, which is something that's been going on more and more in recent years, also with both UFOs and cryptids. And when she goes down the road I think she's about a half mile away, all the electronics came back on.
See, that's very telling to me, Stan, when you're having very similar phenomenon with the cryptids.
Yeah, that's something that's being reported more and more, various types of electromagnetic effects. And I think it's all somehow, more I know about the phenomenon, I think a lot of these different anomalies are somehow, there's some connections, there's some correlation between a lot of these different things going on. And it's something that needs a lot of scientific study, because this is a very strange ongoing phenomenon. The UFO phenomenon is not a rare thing. It goes on here in Pennsylvania. I deal with it all the time. It's every year, all year round, in all type of weather conditions, in the snow, in beautiful Sunday afternoons, daytime, nighttime. It's an ongoing phenomena, and we hear about it a lot. I know many other investigators, they get calls, organizations get reports, and how much don't we hear about? There is so much of this going on. It's a very frequent phenomena.
Do you often collaborate with some of these organizations like MUFON and what's the other one called? Nightcap, I think it is.
Nightcap's long gone. That was years and years ago. But you have the National UFO Reporting Center, and I'm in touch with members of a lot of the groups. There's a lot of smaller groups that people don't know about, and there's many, many really good independent researchers kind of keep low-key, but they get reports. So I'm in touch with a lot of different people.
Right on. So as far as you now, my understanding, you've written a series of books. Can you tell us just a little bit about those books and where we can find them?
Yeah, well, the books, the best way to get books right now, and the fastest way because of the situation, would be to order them from Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. Right now I have 3 books out, and of course the DVD you talked about on Keksburg, The Untold Story. But and I have a 4th book that I hope will be out in about a month or 2. But anyhow, the book that really goes into great detail about all those very, very weird happenings during the 73-74 outbreak with UFOs and Bigfoot and a lot of other weird things and the Mystery Men. It's called Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook. My first book is called Really Mysterious Pennsylvania. It has a lot of cases in it where people were physically very close to UFOs and cryptids. So very, very close-range detailed reports of a lot of weird things and many things we didn't talk about today. My 3rd book is called Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures, and gets into some very bizarre cryptid cases, Bigfoot cases, UFO cases, and a lot of these are cases people just have never heard about before. So those are all available on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. My website is stangordon.info, I-N-F-O. So there's a lot of information on there, and that's just an example what you see of the reports that I get. And there's contact information on there. The email, the easiest way to get me is email is paufo@comcast.net.
Stan, this has been an absolutely amazing conversation. I can't overemphasize how important your research and investigations have contributed to the UFO and paranormal research fields. I can't thank you enough for your efforts, and I can't thank you enough for being on the program with us. After your new book comes out, I definitely would be interested in having you back sometime.
And we're glad to talk to you again. I'm sure I enjoyed being on the program today.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Stan Gordon with the Paranormal Pennsylvania Files. You're listening to Project Stargate. Have a blessed day.